Okay, so welcome to everyone who just joined our webinar about the future of work after the pandemic. This webinar is a part of the series of interviews and podcasts we're doing with the expert for our Youth Time Summer School. It is happening already in August. And just a few words about who we are and what is the Youth Time Summer School. We're an international nonprofit for young people, run by young people from all over the world. And every year we organize two major international events. So one of which is Youth Time Summer School, is happening upcoming August in Iceland. The idea is to help young people to prepare for the future for possible changes connected to technology and innovation. And the theme is future skills for workplace sustainability, where you, David, will be one of our experts. And as your expertise is being in Forbes spread and third in Romania for the work to promote education and digital skills, it's a great asset, of course, to the topic.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to the discussion.
And I think we can start. Yes, we have people joining. We can see the comments. Okay. So, David, as a topic of the future of the work after the pandemic, could you describe us how the future look like for you?
It's a big question, I think, for all of us. But what I think, and I based on my thinking process on the research I've done, not just now since the crisis has started, but even before, on the future of work, is that the future, and in this case now already the present, is better characterized by an acronym called VUCA, which I will write here for people joining us in the conversation, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. All 4 words which might be scary, but this is the new reality, the new normal, I think. This is an acronym borrowed from the US military. They've been using it for quite some time to describe some of their efforts around the world. Yeah, nowadays I don't want to say we're all going to become military professionals, but we all have to think in terms of a very volatile and unstable job market and the professional world in a sense. So I think we should be better prepared for such a world.
And also the pre-word for everybody who just joining us, already joined. This is an interaction-based webinar, so you're more than encouraged to write your questions in the chat. The questions that you already have in mind, and what is your major concern, or what is your major question about the future of work after the pandemic, feel free to write it down, so we're going to take it as we go with the conversation.
Yeah, and no question is too basic to be asked, so do go ahead and ask any related question, obviously, to the topic future of work, but feel free to ask anything concerning this.
And I can start off with one interesting question we've got from the poll that we posted about what people are interested to know. So we have one question is, what soft skills specifically finance graduate will need for getting a better job, and how can we develop oneself for adapting in the changing job market?
I think regardless of your industry, there was some research conducted that I think the Finnish government level, I think the Ministry of Education in Finland initially started it, and then I think it was also seen in the US during Obama's administration. The 4 C's, as I like to call them, and I think the acronym they also use is the 4 C's, which is creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and communication. These 4 soft skills are the foundation of the sort of a career of the future. I mean, they already are probably the most important soft skills, but especially going forward with the increasing amount of automation, of robots coming in and taking some of the tasks we do, some of the, let's say, more data-driven or repetitive tasks, such soft skills which help us humans be more, help us be different from robots will be increasingly more important going forward. So 4 C's, creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and communication.
And if we're talking, so this were the major soft skills, and if we're talking about the experiences, it was part of the question, what specific experiences one should have, if we can generalize.
specific experience to develop these particular skills? I think there's no one specific experience which would help you develop all these four skills. It's actually a combination of experiences, but you should definitely start. And I know many of your members of the Youth Time International community are young professionals, young graduates, perhaps. So volunteering is something we can do at all ages, but especially when we're young, it's a great place to learn and to learn in a very safe environment, so to say. It's you're not going to get fired if you make a mistake. Maybe your colleague in the NGO will tell you, hey, you should do this better. So it's a safe space to try out and to step up and become leaders in our community, for instance. And there's many NGOs in which you can do this. I can share only from my experience. AIESEC is one which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and it's an NGO I was part of, an organization, international organization actually. Rotaract, which is the sort of a junior version of Rotary, another international organization focused on youth engagement and community development. So there's plenty of volunteering organizations, both big and small, in which you can be involved and develop these soft skills which I mentioned.
So
I see
in
there's
other
plenty of questions piling up here already, but I hope there's somebody managing the chat because I see it's exploding with questions. It's good to
yes.
see.
So I'll just choose. I will pick the interesting one. So we have one from Natalia asking which of the jobs mentioned in the World Economic Forum are the most risk resistant, and if you can elaborate also which one will be the most affected after the pandemic. The sectors.
The sort of report I think Natalia is referring to is also a report I quoted in a recent post I made on LinkedIn, which I think you shared with the attendees.
Yes.
So that report and also the report from McKinsey found out that actually, unfortunately, the pandemic is posing a big threat to pretty much the same jobs that were already at risk because of automation. Jobs which require face-to-face contact, physical work, jobs in warehouses, manufacturing, jobs in retail, jobs in which you had to do mundane work but work with people. Unfortunately, these jobs during the pandemic and especially post the pandemic might be changed altogether. The pace of change and the speed of change depends on the country and context, of course. So most at risk manufacturing, warehousing, and also retail jobs and sort of client-facing roles. And then jobs which are the safest, obviously, are jobs now which have to do something with technology. There's an increasing trend in companies adopting robotic process automation software. I can write the acronym here for people to Google it afterwards. So this software is becoming more and more used, and unfortunately, it does displace a few people out of their jobs, but it's also fairly straightforward to learn how to use. So this is a software, and there are many others, sort of digital tools that if you're going to learn now, regardless of the sector you choose to be in, it might be quite relevant in the future. But if there would be one sector which is definitely growing, is within the health sector. Becoming a nurse has never been probably more important and needed. So both men and women, I think, should go for such a career if they want to have a safe career and also a rewarding career going forward. Because as we've seen with the current crisis, there's not enough people choosing this career until now for different reasons. So I think nursing and taking care of people, be it young, old, or sick, is going to be an industry, if you want to call it, or a sector, the caring economy, as the World Economic Forum, I think, called it, which is going to be growing exponentially, together with this digital sector, or the sort of work that involves digital technologies.
And it's a related question about digital transformation we have from where now. Do you see the imminent digital transformation as a threat that could increase the wealth and skills gap between developed and developing countries, or rather an opportunity to rebuild inclusively?
It's a very good question, and it's a very difficult to ask to answer question, because I think the digital transformation is good, and definitely it's been speed up by the current crisis. However, there will definitely be a sort of inequality increase as well, because not all countries and companies are as prepared to deal with the fast pace of digital transformation, and some, and if we speak about companies, will be put out of the business because of this crisis, because they're not fast enough and agile enough to change their ways and become more digital. Governments alike, not all governments were ready to support their citizens, their children, their young people to study remotely. Not all schools, especially in countries in the eastern part of Europe, where I'm currently based, in my home country is Romania, we had plenty of young people who were unfortunately barred from being, in school, obviously because of the crisis, but then also when they had to study from home, they didn't have access to internet, didn't have a laptop. So the inequality is a huge risk, and I think it's going to be growing because of this, both automation and post-pandemic effects. However, digital can be used in the same way as an opportunity to help mediate some of these challenges. You can use digital again to connect people to education, even if they have to stay in house. As long as you make it, as I previously mentioned, equal, and you distributed it across the society, not just within cities or within a specific part of the society.
Yes, so there is a lot of data on the sectors and the future of the jobs, and actually there are some, thankfully, very positive that technology and innovations would create more job opportunities. It's just about adjusting to digital development in them.
Yes, exactly.
So we have a question also from Anna, that technologies and innovations are developing faster than ever. Is it really possible to predict what skills will be useful in 10 years, and how many years ahead we can actually see, in your opinion?
Skills that will be useful, yes, it's easy to predict. As I mentioned, soft skills will definitely be in high demand, and probably even higher than today, because automation is happening already. It cannot be stopped, and it actually can be good if we leverage it properly, if we use it for its benefits, So soft skills will be more important, and the ones I just mentioned, the communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity, the 4 Cs, are important now already. So why not in 10 years, when there's going to be just probably more room for people who have these skills? Obviously, it's hard to predict the future of jobs. And when people ask me about predicting the future, I usually don't like to make predictions. I like to do research and sort of collaborate different research findings to make any sort of opinion. But I can definitely see the future of skills is easier to predict than the future of jobs, because, as I said, skills-wise, soft skills are going to be super important, and the basic level of digital skills, meaning knowing how to use email, knowing how to use Zoom. These are skills which, again, we're privileged to know. We're probably one of the few people who know them, thinking outside of our bubble, because again, this is a planet with over 7.5 billion people. Only half of it has internet access. So again, basic digital skills means having access to internet across the world. But then when it comes to jobs, it's very hard to predict, because these depend on the human creativity, which has, in my opinion, no limits. And who would have thought maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago that there would be today YouTube influencers, people uploading YouTube videos and then making money out of this? I'm working in the field, and I would never was able to predict such a thing 10 or 15 years ago. So hard to predict the jobs, but the skills I think are easier to predict.
Maybe you can tell from your own experience. We also have a lot of questions on about the soft skills that you mentioned, 4 Cs. Can you mention some good examples how you can help and encourage employees develop the skills, maybe from your own experience?
I mean, I will still go back to my example with volunteering. It's the easiest way to test these skills. Obviously, if you already work, it's good within the company to test them. But if you're a young graduate, or if you're still studying, volunteering is the best place to develop your soft skills. And you can carry on being a volunteer throughout your life. I think this is another important message. I've been working for 5 or 6 years already, but I haven't stopped being a volunteer. I'm still active in a few NGOs. I still take time off my study or work agenda to do things for the community. So I think it's important to carry out these sort of habits throughout our lives.
And getting back to the topic specifically about COVID, we have a question. Do you think COVID opened our eyes to get rid of some basic jobs, time-consuming physical meetings and costly resource allocation, or do you see it as the beginning of an ugly crisis for job markets and the economy?
Yes to both questions. It's already a crisis. There's already companies which you would never imagine that they would stop hiring. And I refer to big tech companies. They did stop hiring for a few months, and some are still not hiring. So it's probably the toughest crisis when it comes to the economy. In some people say it's worse than the financial crisis in the 2008 2009. Some compare it to the crisis in the 20th century, 1930s. So it's definitely a huge crisis. But then at the same time, it will help us realize what's more important. It will, in my opinion, it will help us see that some of the meetings we had at work face to face, not all of them were needed. it will also make us realize that not everybody should be in a meeting all the time, but only the people who are actually the decision makers involved or the implementers, the people who to actually have to discuss things. Where we have many meetings in the corporate world in which you invite more people than you should. And I personally believe in the mantra, which I think Jeff Bezos put forth about never having a meeting with more people than you would need to feed just with the pizza. So if you need to buy 2 or 3 pizzas, it means you have too many people in the meeting. If it's just one, it's between 5 and 6 or 7 people. I think it's the maximum, he said, to have in a meeting. And I think the current crisis did make us more, in a sense, aware of this factor that we actually do many things unproductively, and we can make things a bit more smoothly going forward. So habit-wise, it helps us a lot. Crisis-wise, it's definitely a crisis, and I see many young people struggling to find a job, and it's an issue we all have now, and we have to be patient because things will be back to a new normality sooner or later, but not now. I think summer is still quite volatile, so I expect things to go back to a sort of new normal from September onwards.
Mm-hmm. And about things being volatile, how would you advise young people to just stay sane and stay patient? What you mentioned about job search, because you have a lot of things going on at the same time. Second wave of the pandemic that everybody's predicting. Then you have the job loss because of automatization. So how would you advise an individual level just stay sane about it?
By simply working on themselves, developing their skills. I think it's never been a better time to be a bit focused on ourselves. Self-care is a concept which appears a lot in the media now. Taking care of ourselves, be it mentally, physically, emotionally. Um, Obviously still applying for jobs, not ignoring that component altogether, but by focusing on yourself and seeing you progress in other areas of your life, which depend on your control, because obviously we do have a bit more control when it comes to how much time we spend outside jogging, or how much time we spend taking care of our selves by meditating. That's within our control. The fact that we're still waiting to get an answer from an application, or we're still this company we want to work for is still not hiring. These are things outside of our control. So that's why we shouldn't focus on them that much. So focusing on ourselves will help us go through the crisis and come out of it stronger and better prepared for whatever job opportunities might arise.
Would you also, what would we say about different data and different statistics we have available about the predictions for the future jobs? Is it relevant to really keep track of them number-wise and seeing all these variables, or just, as you mentioned, to focus on developing your soft skills and what you can predict in the future?
It is, as I said, I mean, one of the roles I kind of took for myself in these last couple of months was to read all these reports, which many people don't read because they're just long and for some people boring. I've done that. I've read many of the recent reports from the World Economic Forum, McKinsey, PwC, Google, and I've tried to summarize them a bit for the average reader who just wants to get to the conclusion. What's the job that I want to maybe potentially have in the future because it's growing? What are the skills I need for it? And based on this, I think it's important to look at some of the statistics. The summaries I provided, I think, are useful exactly for this, to get to the gist of the problem. And to keep following them, but again, not be too focused on becoming a nurse will drop next year, maybe from number 1 growing in-demand job to number 2 or 3. It means I don't have to become a nurse anymore. Obviously, you have to follow your passion and where your sort of skill set is. But if you have two, let's say, if you already want to take care of people, it's already a sign that you can choose potentially between 2 or 3 main careers which are growing now. So first of all, you have to think within yourself, what is the sort of job or sector that attracts you, and then look at some of these statistics to see if that sector or job is growing, or is it actually predicted by many sources to be declining and it's not really a career for the future. So start within your own passions and then look at all these statistics and results.
Okay, so somewhere in the middle. We can take a few more questions. So the last one we have from Alexander: what will go back to the way it was pre-COVID? Maybe you can talk about some specific sectors or skills.
I mean, it's a really broad question from Alexander, but I can definitely say what will go back to what it was pre-COVID will be our desire to meet with people face to face. I don't think this will go away. I think from the contrary, it will just grow. I think all of us are looking forward to see our friends, to hug our friends again, and we're looking forward to a time in which we're going to be able to do this without thinking about health consequences. And this will mean that also we will return to the offices, we will return to face-to-face meetings, but it's just going to be probably more socially distanced offices and less face-to-face meetings than we were used to. But still, this core human desire to connect with other humans will remain, and we will return to that as soon as possible. I think we all want to go back to that normal for sure.
And okay, there is one more specific for Mustafa. During the lockdown, some countries provided great incentives to its citizens, while others with high rates of poverty struggled immensely. What are some key learning points for the governments to consider as part of the risk mitigation strategy in times of global crisis and job market crisis?
I'm not sure what incentives you mean. What incentives did the governments provide to citizens? I mean, I don't know many countries which provided incentives. They just said, citizens, you have to stay in lockdown. And the incentive was obviously a monthly
Yeah,
allowance.
monthly allowance.
Okay, so maybe you're also referring to some sort of a UBI, universal basic income, perhaps, which is becoming more of a trend nowadays. I think initially most countries are not prepared to offer many monthly allowances. I see your example is from Canada, a country which is obviously super developed and it has a pretty good welfare system as compared to many other countries in the world. So I think going back to your question, I recently read that I think the countries which were better prepared to face the crisis had two things in common. First of all, they were countries that have been through a similar crisis with SARS in Asia. So funny enough, or luckily enough, most Asian countries were actually quite prepared for the crisis because they've already been through this pandemic, called SARS before, just I think 10 years ago, I think if I'm not mistaken. And the second important aspect is the cultural aspect. Most of these countries, especially the ones in Asia, are of a collective nature. They're less individualistic than some countries in Europe or the United States, in which if the government tells you, for the good of the people, don't go out, they're more likely to stay indoors because this is the way they've been brought up to, collective spirit. So I think both experience and the culture within the country were important factors to the way the countries themselves were able to deal with the lockdown. And what are the key learnings from governments to consider? First of all, to have a mitigation strategy in place, because I'm not sure all governments were prepared for this crisis, at least not to the same degree. And then I think what governments are still lacking is the sort of a collaboration which we were not seeing initially, even within the EU. I was a bit surprised, and not in a good way, to see that many European countries were, besides obviously having to lock their borders for obvious reasons, but not willing to collaborate initially as well as they are now collaborating, helping each other, share resources. This is something which more governments should be prepared and willing to do going forward.
So I think we can take a last question. Yeah, there is Mustafa replied.
We still have, I think, time for two questions, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe from somebody else. Sorry, Mustafa, but I think there were a few other questions just before. If we can take some other questions as well, so we can.
Okay, there is one from Alexander. Will governments think about localization and diversify more of its supply chain to protect against the risk of a future pandemic?
Yes, it's a good question again. Localization is already happening. We see more and more countries relocating their supply chain and manufacturing in locally, taking factories or from China or from other places in Asia back to Europe or to America. So this is a big trend. Diversifying, I'm not sure. I mean, diversifying is always good if you have the capability. The first step will be to just relocate your supply chains closer to home.
And there is one more. How jobs will be provided back to migrant workers who have lost jobs in this current pandemic in upcoming days, I think upcoming months as well?
Yeah, this is a really tough question to answer because I also don't know what's there to be done. I think there's so many people who lost their jobs, migrant and non-migrant alike. So I definitely think in this case, the only short-term solution is for the government to step up, to have some sort of a universal basic income or a conditional basic income for people who are displaced and who are finding it harder than other people to find a job. And they might take half a year to find a job. And that time, if they're not working, the government should step up to support these people, be it migrant or non-migrant. I think enough studies have shown that migrant workers or some of the most important workers in any economy because they provide some of the creativity and outside the box thinking that made countries like America, for instance, the innovative champion they are today.
And maybe to narrow down the last question a bit from Meral, what your opinion about the pandemic affects the education sector? Maybe you can give some positive example how education system adapting to current urgent need for soft skills you were mentioning, forces and digital experiences.
Yeah, I love this question from Meral because I'm super passionate about education. And I recently had the chance to be invited in a similar call with a professor of mine, a professor I used to have in Scotland where I studied. And he was quite worried that the current pandemic will affect even British universities, which are usually well resourced, because many of them depend on international students from China, from the Middle East, who are not going to be as willing to come to study abroad after this crisis, and maybe they won't even be able to come. So this lack of funding, which was going to be probably for the next term, from the next year of studies, will definitely affect many universities, and they will have to change their offering. Some universities will actually go bankrupt, literally, because they cannot support their services anymore. Especially universities which are already not top-ranking universities. So I think the most affected universities or institutions, educational institutions, that will be affected by the crisis are the ones which are not yet in the top tier, let's say. And for all the rest, the key way to, let's say, come out of this crisis with a better outcome is to definitely prepare for online learning, and to get support from companies, because I think what universities haven't managed to do, and even top universities, is to better connect the sort of skills they teach with the sort of skills needed on the job market. And I think now it's the time for companies to step up and universities to be more open to collaborate with them to better prepare students, be it online or offline, for the jobs of the future.
So it's again about adapting to the ongoing trends. Okay, so let's maybe take the last question. How much financially must be spent to generate employment opportunities in these times?
Yeah, it's a really tough question to answer. I think just to give you an example of universal basic income, which I think I previously mentioned, the US, I think, was calculating if they would implement this universal basic income, which means giving everybody in America €1,000 per month to use in times of crisis, to use for education, for other opportunities. It would cost them, I think, between I'm going to give a range so I'm not mistaken, between $1 to $3 trillion to implement, which sounds a lot, but it's still not a huge amount compared to the amount spent now, or the amount that the governments will have to spend to get people employed again, or to help people who are getting sick because they don't have money for medicine and so on. So I think still this cost of a UBI pales in comparison to the costs that we will have to face as a society if there's no sort of a safety net for people, migrant people or non-migrant people, again, who have been displaced because of either COVID-19 or because of automation, because automation doesn't take a break even in COVID, and it's actually being accelerated. And it's not bad, because automation is still taking jobs which are not the more interesting jobs for humans, but it's still a question of what do you do with the people who are displaced because of these two factors. And many governments don't have yet an answer, and I do hope the current crisis will determine them to think harder and faster to find an answer.
Okay, we touched upon a lot of topics. If there is one takeaway you would like our attendees to take, what would it be?
It would be, again, my message, which was already an answer to a question, I think, to really focus on yourselves in the coming months. Attend the Youth Time International Summer School, attend any sort of summer schools or development programs which will help you become a better person, professionally and personally, and be patient, because the new normality is coming, but we just have to wait a bit longer, more likely, as I said, until autumn, for the labor market to pick up and recover, and for many of you who are looking now for opportunities to be able again to find ones and start new jobs and new projects again. So be patient and work on yourselves.
Yes, so for all the participants, you can also follow our Youth Time International Women events. We organize 2 of them each year. We also have Youth Time magazine, where I'm an editor currently, so we try to publish as much opportunities and useful information of developing soft skills, where you can check it out. So thank you, David, a lot for your time and interesting discussion. We will see you soon in person in Iceland.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to see you in Iceland, and all the best to all the attendees who joined us for this conversation.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.